Today, Ward is speaking, and I've known Ward for quite a while, and I can tell you that he doesn't mind a challenge. First, he got his PhD in linguistics, but in the meantime, he's been doing research in 5 countries, if I'm not mistaken, on 4 continents. He's been coordinating research projects, and his interests are in a number of topics like digital discourse in language learning context, language acquisition and development, learning analytics as well, and obviously the impact of science communication. Now he'll tell you about IMPACTLAB, which is related to today's talk. But right now I would like to mention that he is at Monash University in Australia, and that also means that he's making the effort of doing this talk rather late at night. So thanks a lot, Ward, and thank all of you who are joining us from other countries to do this. Now, to get the most out of today's talk, I would really encourage you to ask any questions you have. You can do that in the Q&A section. And Ward will also invite you to take part in his lecture at some times. Now, if you have any questions, either I'll ask them to Ward during his talk or at the end. So don't hesitate to put them in the Q&A screen at any time. I think that's everything I needed to say. So Ward, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you so much, Helene. Hello, everyone, and welcome to this little lecture on the impact of science communication. I am going to share my screen in a minute, but I'm now giving you at least the opportunity to say hi to me, hello, and for me saying hi to you. Let me quickly share my screen. And I want to start today off with a little question for you guys. And that is a very simple question. However, the answer to this question might not be as simple. What, according to you, is impact in science communication? And I invite you to, in a couple of keywords, write your ideas down in the chat. And in a minute, I will ask Helene to give me a little bit of a rundown of the major themes or the things that jump out to her. So over to you. What you think, in a couple of keywords, is impact? Now, as you're doing that, I will do some quick introductions. You can keep on chatting about this question. However, as introductions are always due, I am Ward Peeters. I am a lecturer currently at Monash University, lecturer in linguistics. But as Helene has already said, my interests are or include a lot of different things that have to do with language and the impact of language. I am part of the IMPACTLAB, an inter-university research group that researches how to measure the impact of science communication. Of course, it's not me by myself. We have a wonderful team here, including Madeleine Strick from Utrecht University, Anne Sanstra from Leiden University, as well as Patty de Jong from both Leiden University and Utrecht University. What we do is research as well as development. A little bit more on that later, but I'm going to go back to my initial question. Now, what is impact? Helene, what does the chat say about impact?
I think I lost you there. I hope everybody else still hears you, but I assume that your question was, what is a series of answers to your question? Yes, the keyword is change. It's in different manners concerning change of behavior, a concrete effect of academic research, the power to influence, but also understanding is a word that I see a couple of times. Effective communication that enables understanding. Also this phrase, when people take into account what you want to teach them and then make a change once again. And also reflection. I'm quickly going to scan through them again. But that's the general response. And also someone said measurable consequences. And I think that might be an interesting take for you. So I'm giving the floor back to you. Oh,
thank you, Lynn. Oh.
Having results was just added. Having results
Okay.
and power with a smiley.
Okay, interesting. Well, to be honest, I'm already hearing a lot of things that I love to hear when we talk about impact. We talk about change, we talk about, yes, results, and we also talk about, which we might not really have been delving into yet, the people that we want to reach. Now, what we have been doing with the Impact Lab is looking at what science communication can mean for scientists, how we reach the people that we want to reach, and what kind of effects we can establish on that target audience. So what is impact? Well, let's find out. With the Impact Lab, we have been working with more than 100 projects in the Netherlands. We are a nationally funded research group funded by the National Research Council in the Netherlands, as well as the National Research Agenda. And what we do as the Impact Lab is we have a dual system. First of all, we do research. And as I said before, we have data of more than 100 projects nationwide. In this research, we are going to look for the active ingredients of science communication, what works and what doesn't work. And we are going to develop support. We are going to look at how we can measure the impact of science communication, what kind of different parameters should be taken into account. We create pathways for people to create a meaningful and efficient science communication measurement. We have a toolbox available with all kinds of different tools that people can use, as well as a question bank with the most common, most effective questions that you can ask your audience. And of course, you now have already understood that our focus is really on science communication activities and events. This includes a wide range of activities, from big science festivals with hundreds and hundreds or even thousands of participants, to maybe a column in a newspaper, to maybe a children's book presentation that is about a STEM subject or about biology, let's say. So all of these have been included in these 100 projects that we have been working with. If you have a science communication event or an activity that you are planning, always think about what this kind of presentation, all the things that I'm going to talk about, how they apply to you. I think for a Q&A, that will be a very, very interesting approach as well. Now, what I'm going to do in the next couple of, let's say, 30, 40, maybe 50 minutes, is I'm going to first of all talk a little bit about our research, how we define impact, what impact means to us, how we see it emerge in different activities, and then tackle some of the major questions that we see pop up time and time again. These are based on the issues, challenges, and successes of the different projects that we have worked with. Now, I have to say that we as Impact Lab don't necessarily engage with or produce science communication events as the Impact Lab. However, all the members of Impact Lab are science communicators themselves. We as Impact Lab, as our group, what we do is research and development. So you get the best of both worlds, I would say. Right. So first of all, we all have to be on the same page. Hence, we are going to set the scene. When we talk about impact, and this is kind of why I asked you to give a couple of keywords, because I want to know what your stance on this is as well. Now, what we say impact is a process. It is, to be honest, it's work. You have to put effort and time into this. Now, what does it all revolve around? It is measuring what you can or want to measure. And both of these modal verbs are quite important. We can, of course, have a lot of ideas of what impact could mean for our projects or our activities, but we have to be able to put this into something measurable. Also something I think that came up in our little Q&A session in the beginning. Now, when we define impact, we do so by breaking it down into different pieces. And we always say that measuring impact actually revolves around 3 different themes, 3 layers, if you want, of measuring impact. Meaning, or based on the fact that we can look at different types of data that inform us on the effects of our activities. And the first layer of this, the first step, also the easiest step, I think, is looking at output. These are observable achievements or advances of the different projects or activities that we organize. Examples of that, for instance, are the number of visitors that you had, the clicks that your newsletter gets, or the views that your online webinars or YouTube videos get on social media. These is what we call output measures, easily observable and easily measurable. So questions that are linked to output is how many people have visited me, what is their age? Have I gotten a lot of people part of my target audience, yes or no? These are all questions that are part of output, easily measurable, as well as giving a good insight into not only the target audience, but also the range of people that might be coming into contact with your content. Now, after looking at output, which, as I said, is kind of the first step and the most easy step, we might know how many people we were able to reach. However, we know very little about what is actually happening and if there is any type of change or effect with the people that have been engaging with the things that we do. For that, we need some measurements of outcomes. And these are results and effects that apply to the target audience, the people that we have reached. And often we break this down into effects on knowledge on the one hand, attitude or behavior on the other. So do we want to know whether we have changed something in what people know about a certain topic, how they feel or think about a certain topic, or how they act? For instance, projects that are targeting people's waste management would be a good topic for the measurement of behavioral change. Of course, attitudes towards the topic and knowledge about the topic would also be interesting targets for our measurements. A little bit more about that later, but I hope you already see that we have different types of data to work with. First one, output. Second one, outcomes. The third one, the big one, of course, is impact, sustainable changes or effects, and often changes that go beyond the target audience, changes that are sustainable and effective, which means that they also are there in the long run. They're there for a while, hence sustainable as well as effective. Now, I hope you also see already that measuring impact, as we often hear, isn't necessarily something that has to do with the impact as this big idea of sustainable change and effects. What we often do when we measure impact is going to look at output and outcomes. And when we do that time and time again, we have the knowledge and we have the information to start and say something about impact. That's what I mean when I say impact or measuring impact is a process. It's work, it takes time and effort, and it takes vision. So these 3 different types, these 3 different levels is what we are gonna delve into a little bit more today. When you want to make or create a new type of measurement, or when you want to look into your impact, think about these 3 points, these 3 levels. And they are interchangeable. Well, they're not interchangeable, they are interlinked, of course. When you reach a lot of people, it doesn't necessarily mean that you have any major effects on them. No, you always need to look at the things one and the other in order to say something about impact. So this is the base that we start from. Now, when we have these things down, there is a little caveat. And the caveat is that there is no single approach to measure impact. There is no single approach to audit, benchmark, or evaluate any given activity by a researcher, practitioner, or community partner. So we have to make decisions on a marked pathway to the right tools, the right design, the right questions, etc. So we are gonna have to make choices. What kind of output is relevant for us? If we are targeting primary school children in one of our activities, and the only children that we reach are high schoolers, well, that is important information to know. What are the output measures that you then have to put into place? Age, schooling, maybe even location, to know where all these different target audience members, where they are located and where they are coming from. Now, if we want to look at outcomes, again, we have to make the right calls here. What do we really want to measure? What is most important for our activity? So this all leads to a marked pathway and the fact that we have to make pretty tough choices sometimes. Now, this whole process of measuring impact, as the Impact Lab, we tried to make it as simple as possible, but also give you a little bit of a plan as a marked pathway to map impact and to map the measurement of impact. And it all starts at the very beginning, where you have a mission. You have a goal and a target audience in mind. And we have noticed when we work with different people and with different activities and projects that this is an easy step. People have heart and people want to get a message out. They know what they want to do, and they know most of the time who they want to reach. So this is where it all starts. You have a mission. Of course, you have to have a plan, and we often say you have to have a measuring plan or a measurement plan. Thinking about your impact is something you have to do from the very start, and it really ties in with the goals and the target audience that you have. So think about what you can measure and how you want to measure it. Then, of course, you're going to collect data and actually measure the impact by means of output and outcomes of your activity. You're going to learn from these things as you're going to analyze and interpret the results, and you are going to manage these results, formulating improvement goals, which of course then lead again to your definition of your goals and your target groups for the future, creating a new mission and restarting the cycle all over again. And this is, according to us and our experience, a good way of measuring your impact. And this is a cycle that you have to go through a couple of times before you get it right. So this is a little bit about the process of measuring impact. Now, I did bring a couple of major questions that occur when you are going to put all this theory to practice. But before I do, I know I now have bombarded you with terms and concepts. Are there any major burning questions? And I'm going to go back to Helene for that. Are there any challenges, issues that people want me to address before I go on?
There are some interesting questions, but I think you might discuss some of them in the next couple of slides. Okay. So I suggest to wait a bit, and I can still bring them up later.
Good. Perfect. So when we are going to start measuring our impact, there are a couple of challenges and issues that we sometimes need to address. And one of them is, how do you know what to measure? There are a lot of options here. Hence, in order to make a measurement plan, you need to have a critical eye for what you're doing and what you want to get out of your projects. I would be able, or I could be talking about a lot of different things here. However, I chose to focus on something that most people struggle with. And that is making sure that you are measuring the thing that is most important to your activity. So this is more focused on measuring outcomes and not so much on measuring impact. The question that you always have to ask yourself when you are starting to measure the impact of science communication is, what do you want to do and what do you want to know? And we have subdivided this in 3 major aspects. And we have attached some keywords to it to make it a little bit more manageable for you. So what do you want to do and what do you want to know? Do you want to enhance people's knowledge about a certain topic? Meaning, do you want to inform them, teach? Do you want to educate, train, or coach? Do you want to influence behavior? Do you want to inspire, motivate, convince, spark creativity, empower, enable? Or do you want to enrich awareness, create new experiences, create new insights, create perspective, improve understanding, improve attitudes towards science or a chosen topic? Now, what a lot of people who are involved in science communication will say is, oh, all 3. Of course, I want people to know more about the topic. Yes, and of course, I want to enrich their awareness. Now that they know more about it, oh, it's maybe a new experience for them. And yes, if we can inspire and motivate, that would be perfect. And we say that is all good. However, when you start to measure the impact of science communication, we always advise focus. Choose one of these major themes and make that the main target or the main topic of your measurement, which means that measuring impact really is making choices. And when you think about the activities or the projects that you're establishing, think about what you want to know first. Do you want to know if you are actually informing people? Do you want to mainly know if you are inspiring or convincing them? Or do you want to know more about improved understanding or attitudes towards a certain topic? Depending on what you do and depending on your goals and your aims, this is where the first choices will lie. This is where you will have to make some critical decisions. And I brought a little example, and the example is an example of an art exhibition, and that was on the use of personal data and algorithms in people's daily lives. This was an art exhibition, part of the science festival that was located at Lowlands. And Lowlands is a big music festival in the Netherlands. The target audience here were adults visiting the music festival, and we aimed at about 750 people participating over the course of 3 days. Of course, in such a big setting and with such a particular project, we had to make the choice, informing people who were organizing it, what to measure. So what are you going to do with this? This art exhibition had many different goals, many different aims. They wanted to inspire people to think about their own personal data and what algorithms were doing to them. They wanted them to realize that big tech is everywhere, that they knew a lot about us. They wanted them to really gain some more knowledge on how all the systems work. So again, a lot of different parts to this puzzle. However, we said we are in a setting that will require us to really target one specific question. So we agreed on measuring people's attitudes towards the use of their personal data and their personal use of algorithms in their daily lives. And the photo that I have included gives you an impression of how we actually did that. We gave people three different statements. Data and algorithms make my life easier, they make my life more equitable, or they make my life more efficient. Again, we are targeting adults at a music festival. We don't want to give them any questionnaires, nor want to quiz them on anything. Our idea was we need something that's very engaging, but also enables us to gather a lot of data. We lured people in with a big bingo setup. And as you can see, the bingo balls relate to the questions and the statements that we had. And we let people play with it, asking them the questions and really using that as a basis for dialogue. Doing this, we reached almost 1,000 people and got a lot of both quantitative and qualitative data out of them, both looking at how they reacted to these statements and then what they had to say about it, both before and after this art exhibition. And again, there are a lot of different aims and goals here. However, we said, what is the most important thing we need to know? Well, are there any changes in people's attitudes towards the use of data and algorithms based on this specific project? Of course, in iterations and new iterations of this can be changed. But here, for the first one, we chose attitude. Hence, we made a very, very hard but necessary decision.
But if you don't mind
Yes.
me interrupting, we have a question or a comment. Somebody says, to me, easier and more efficient are very similar. I don't know if you want to go into the difference between those two statements.
Yeah, of course. Yes. Easier and more efficient was defined both by the artists that made the exhibition as well as us. So that was part of the dialogue, for instance, that we had with the people actually doing the science communication event. Now, the difference between easier and more efficient is easier could be, for instance, making things more accessible rather than more efficient, as that really more concerns how processes are automated for you. To be honest, this was also a question that we got a lot from people at the music festival, which informed us on the fact that we might, in future iterations, have to change one of these statements to make bigger distinctions between them.
Thank you from the question. And one more question that I just saw. By using the three statements, aren't we measuring the impact of the information itself and not the science communication impact? Now, Ward, if you say I'm going into that later, feel free.
I will go a little bit into that later, but it's also a good question that we can answer in the Q&A session, I think.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, good. Now, doing these type of events where a lot of people are involved, as well as a lot of scientists, and in this case, also people from the arts are involved, of course, there are a couple of lessons that we have learned. One is that you have to make informed decisions on what you want to measure, and let the questions and the question types really match the purpose of the activity and the aims of the activity. As I already kind of pointed out, is that the questions that we asked were good and people had different opinions on them. And again, they were also the start or the startup for more questions and more dialogue in the end. However, we did see that the difference between more efficient and easier, that indeed that was not a very clear distinction for everyone. Also not in the groups that we eventually reached. Hence, that informs us in our own processes and in our own activities, what to do and how to improve. Now, if you are interested in different ways of measuring impact, we as the IMPACTLAB have a toolbox available as well, and we have a decision tree as a guide with a couple of basic questions on the goals and the targets and the aims of your projects and how you can measure those and which decisions then you have to make along the way. More on that on my last slide, where I will give you a QR code and a link to our website where everything is available. The big takeaway from this first lesson and this first activity was that measuring impact really revolves around making choices and building bridges between your project, the aims that we have, the audience that we want to reach, as well as the ways that we want to measure impact. It is all interconnected. Another question that we dealt with a lot: how do you make people participate? Because you can have a great setup and great questions and a great idea on how you want to tackle all of that. But how do you make sure that people are actually coming to you and answer your question? Now, we collaborated with the National Research Agenda at one of their big events, which was Expedition Next. A lot of different people coming together to talk and play with science. This was aimed at children aged between 6 and 12 years old. There were, in total, more than 10,000 participants in this big science festival. Researchers from all over the Netherlands came together and played with science, introduced it to the children, and really gave them a whole day full of experiences, experiments, etc. What we wanted to do is reach at least 100 children and see what they thought about this event. Now, this was an opportunity for us to test a couple of our own instruments and our own questions. What we did is we developed an online tool. The questions that we had to be simple and they had to be visually appealing because of the target audience that we had. We also developed a story using comic book style prompts to make sure that people and children knew what they were doing, were engaged with the content, and had a little narrative to follow. Now, in the end, we gave them a quiz asking them, what kind of scientist are you? And this was our final and decisive aim here to really engage children into this type of measurement, making it gamified in such a way that they didn't even know they were participating in some scientific research. Of course, there were payoffs for the children as well. They got quiz results, giving them 1 of 6 profiles or science profiles that they then got a certificate for. So what we did was integrating our measurement within the festival, creating a whole narrative around it, and making sure that something was there for them, that it made sense within the setting and within the whole setup. Now, this kind of payoff is really interesting and necessary in such a specific environment. We learned some lessons at this big festival. First of all, get to know your target audience and adapt your approach to match the world that they live in. And this is something that we thought we had down as IMPACTLAB. We thought, okay, now we've done this, we know everything now, and we're just going to apply all the things that we learned in future iterations. Little did we know that also we are sometimes prone to make mistakes. We thought, now that we have developed a great questionnaire designed as a game for children at science festivals, we can apply this in different ways, and we can apply this at different festivals as well. The next festival that we applied this to, we thought we have everything set up, we're just gonna use it the way we did it. However, the festival was really different. The target audience was really different. They came with different expectations and they came with different points of view. The 2 festivals that we tried to compare was this big science festival, Expedition Next, and then a festival for children that was way more centered around music and games, etc. There was not a lot of science there. And then we thought, oh, let's just compare and let's just use the same stuff. big mistake from us because we didn't take our target audience into account, and the fact that they came to these festivals with a lot of different expectations. Hence, get to know your target audience and also go into detail. The fact that they were children from the same, or like around the same age, was of course not good enough. That is what we learned the hard way. And that's why I'm telling you this, so you don't make the same mistake. Always think about the mission, the plan, what kind of data you want, as well as how you're going to execute it. Because if you don't, you might bump into the same issues that we did. Make quizzes, activities, games have personal relevance to these children. This is also something that we really learned. Of course, doesn't only apply to children, also applies to adults. If it has personal relevance, if they recognize themselves, or if they see that it's part of a bigger setup, it increases motivation to participate. Always ask yourself the question, what is in it for them? We all know that just running up to people with a clipboard and a questionnaire is not the most effective way of getting their opinions. Dare to be creative and playful. Have a look at our toolbox and our examples for some inspiration. But the real takeaway here is measuring impact is putting the audience first. It's looking at who you want to target and where you want to get all the information from. And as I've told you already, sometimes you bump into walls. Luckily for us, we know that in research, that is how you learn as well. Right, last question that pops up a lot is, how do you organize such a thing? How do you measure impact? Do you need people? Do you need time? Do you need money? Do you need heavenly interventions? Well, sometimes yes, all of the above, and sometimes no. Depends on how you want to organize it and what you want to get out of it. And I brought an example of a activity which is called Kletskoppen. It's Dutch translation to like talking heads, but it's also a little bit of a joke about bald people. It's difficult to explain. However, this activity is aimed at children with a migration background, and what they want to do is teach, inform, and have fun with language, highlighting the fact that multilingualism is something to celebrate. We worked together with them closely, and in their activities, we were able to reach more than hundreds of children as well, and see how they were participating in different activities, where these children came from, what their home languages were, and how they looked at all the activities and what they took home with them as well. You can see here that teaching, informing, having fun, we have three main aims here. Well, of course, what we say is you have to make a choice, and they did. They said, we want to know things about all three of these aims. We are going to develop three different activities that target one of these aims. And we said that is a great idea, and that is what we did. Now, one of those was a container feedback game where we had a lot of boxes where children could throw or like deposit a little ball in, indicating what their opinion was on language and knowing things about language, whether it was easy for them to use different languages, etc. Things we needed to know in order to evaluate this event. What they did, and what we thought was remarkable, was that they made measuring impact an integral part of the project from the start. The things that we have been advocating for is something that they did perfectly. They invested in human power, so they had team members assigned to the job at all times, because measuring impact, in our case, the cases that we of course put forward, is not something you can do just the night before. This is an integral part of your project, an integral part of your activity. And we've also noticed that there are hits and misses. Different questions and different setups were tested out as this project progressed over the months and years that it took place. So how do you organize such a thing? you have to make it a part of the project itself. And that is what we literally, or like we mainly took away from this experience. So provide time and space and resources for measuring impact, and don't reinvent the wheel. You can look over the hedge to your neighbors or see what experts have to say. It's all about trial and error. You can pilot different approaches and different questions before throwing everything but the kitchen sink at it. If you are going to invest in a lot of equipment and the equipment is useless when you want to measure your impact, you know you kind of made a mistake. So pilot before you develop further. Measuring impact is an integral part of the bigger picture. This is the third lesson that I want to give to you as we are talking about the measurement or measuring the impact of science communication. Right. We talked about the basics. We talked about measuring output, measuring outcomes, and using that to get a good idea of what impact we create in the long run. I talked to you about the process of measuring impact, the fact that we have to have a good idea of what we want to do and who we want to involve. We have to make a plan from the start and really make sure that we collect the data that we want to collect, that we measure what we can and want to measure, and that we use those results to really improve our activities and really learn from them to make sure that we are reaching the effects and that we are generating the effects that we want to generate. Good. I'm gonna ask the same question that I asked in the beginning. And the question is, again, what is impact to you? Again, in a couple of keywords in the chat, share your ideas on what the impact of science communication is. And again, in a minute, I'm going to ask Helene to tell me what the different themes are.
I think people are really thinking. Responses are a bit slower than before, so do share anything that pops up. In the meantime, Ward, I don't know if you want to discuss some more questions already, or whether we
can take one question before we go to the chat again.
There's one question that kind of that's kind of broad, so that's why I'm already asking you now. Fanny was wondering whether you recommend SMART objectives, in the acronym, to measure impact.
Yeah, that is certainly a way of approaching it. The fact that you have to make decisions on what you want to measure, you can do that in many different ways. SMART objectives, of course, are a way of doing it. And some of our colleagues, for instance, the impact unit from Germany, from Wissenschaften Dialog, kind of our sister organization in Germany, does apply the SMART model a lot. What we have decided is that we want to focus on measurable output, outcomes, and impact, and hence have a little bit of a different approach. However, they are not mutually exclusive. So yes, you can take the SMART model or SMART goals as the starting point to think about how you want to measure the impact of science communication.
Okay, thank you. Meanwhile, people are sharing their thoughts. I can see some funny comments as well. Maybe I should mention the first differences that I see.
Yeah, sure.
In the meantime, more responses are added. But Kathleen says results that you can/want to measure. So again, it's about results, but it's kind of a different approach, I think. One more is planning a measurable test. Measure of the effects of a SciComm event on a defined audience. Tell me when to stop, Bart.
No.
Some longer sentences like science communication has impact when the receiver is able to tell what they learned to someone else, so tell the story further, or when the receiver experiences and enacts a change. Then Martina says, I guess you're measuring the outcomes of your presentation.
Yes, I am.
She adds, impact is a set of measurable changes in knowledge, attitude, or behavior of the entire audience beyond the target audience. And it's an integral part of any science communication project. And a couple of more answers that include that it's hard to measure, or what you want and can measure, and that it has to be thought of beforehand, so deliberately designed, etc. And someone asks you whether you could show the slide before this one.
This one?
Yeah, I think so. If not, Philippa, please tell us which one it is.
Yeah. I want to maybe quickly comment on one of the comments there. So I now didn't pay a lot of attention to our imagined audience and the target audiences that we have. But one of the big questions that we got from our funding agency, which is the Dutch Research Council, as well as the Dutch Research Agenda, is who is actually participating in all of these science communication events in the Netherlands? Who do we reach? Is it always the same talk? Is it always the same audience, and doesn't even depend on the different activities that we create? So what we said as the Impact Lab, we want to know a little bit more about the audience, about these target audiences and these target groups. What was really important for the Research Council was, they said, we want to know if we reach people who don't have a lot with science, who don't think that science is something for them, who think that science is kind of a weird, distant thing that does not really apply to them. Hence, what we developed is a set of questions to measure people's science capital as they come into these events. Very simple questions on how they feel about science, what kind of emotions it evokes in them, and how they see themselves, yes or no, part of this scientific process. And we have noticed that in some events, we just have the usual suspects of science communication events, being a more urban audience, an audience that mostly has higher degrees, and is in the upper middle class, white family area of the population. What we also have seen is these things change when you bring science and science communication events to the people themselves. So a lot of the activities that were organized in the middle of city centers, at universities or big libraries that were in certain areas, we did get the usual suspects, people who were already engaged with science, who saw themselves as part of the scientific process, who had something with science. Now, if you want to reach the people that are what then the Research Council defines as harder to reach groups, we saw that that was actually the case when we took science communication events and took it to the people themselves, making sure that you have events in neighborhoods where there is not as much access to, like the urban center, where you actually take your activities and make it relevant for the people that you want to reach. And then we saw a difference in this audience that we reached. And one of the ways that we measured that is looking at their science capital. 4 very easy questions to ask, also part of our question bank on our website.
Maybe a question that fits what you just told. but it's a different nuance. Someone was wondering whether the fact that your target audience often, like you said, already shows a big interest in science before exposure. Did you ever experience that it's because of that, changes in attitude are hard to measure, even if you use pre and post setting?
Yeah, changes in attitude are almost always very hard to measure because we often rely on self-report data. However, what we do see is in all the different projects that we have analyzed and assessed is that people who come in with high science capital, who have already good impressions of science, scientists, and the scientific process, often see their impressions confirmed. People who come in with low science capital see bigger changes in attitudes. That is some of the findings that we have found over the years that we have done our measurements, which of course also means that science communication activities don't have an adverse effect often on the audience. So we do see that the effects on attitude are often positive and overwhelmingly positive for people who have lower science capital coming into most of these events. Good. I think to round off, and before we go into the bigger Q&A session, let me quickly round up a couple of the lessons that we learned. I think the first one, the most important one, as you start thinking about your impact, is make informed decision. And as I said before, how to do this is to build the bridges between the project itself, how you're going to set it up, what the aims are, what the audiences are that you want to reach, and the ways you want to measure your impact. All of them have to inform each other and they have to be linked together, because if they are not, you will bump into issues. Maybe the issue will be that you're not collecting the data that you want to collect, or the data that you collect is not relevant to the questions that you have asked or the aims that you have. Making sure that these are interlinked is really vital and it's really key to a good measurement when it comes to impact. The second one is putting the target audience first, making quizzes, activities, games, surveys that you have personally relevant for the participants. We have done that by integrating gamified options within our surveys, really engaging people and children in this case, in my example, with the content at hand and with the questions that we had. And of course, measuring impact, again, is a process. It's a lot of work, but make measuring impact an integral part of the bigger picture. And I say it's a lot of work, I say it jokingly, but science communication and science communication activities are something that require you to have a critical point of view on what you are doing, how you want to get a message across, and what you actually want to get out of it, what effects you want to generate. So all in all, thinking about your impact is a very logical next step. Thinking about what you want to do, how you want to do it, who you want to involve is really at the heart of measuring impact. So in that sense, it's not a lot of work. It's not a lot of effort. It is part of a critical point of view, both towards yourself as towards the work that you are doing together with your colleagues or just maybe by yourself. Good. I want to thank you, first of all, for attending this little webinar on measuring the impact of science communication. If you have any questions, I'm still here for the Q&A. If you want to check out some of our tools, the questions that we ask, what they, of course, stand for and what they measure, you can always have a look at our website, impactlab.science.uu.nl. We have both a Dutch version, as we are a Dutch research group, as well as an English version. And in a couple of weeks' time, we will publish our end report on all the different measurements that we have done. Unfortunately, that will be in Dutch as well for the international audience. I'm sorry for that. However, we are also publishing papers and a lot of info in English as well in the next coming months and in the time to come as well. So do keep an eye on our website, because we will, of course, update everyone there as well.
Thank you, Ward. I'm looking forward to the report. And also, I was delighted with your talk because you, because you zoomed out and thought about or explained to us how we can think about this concept of impact and measuring it, but also helped us out with some very concrete tips and lessons to keep in mind, and the toolbox, obviously. There are quite some questions on different themes, so I'll try and start with a specific theme and go into that. About the last lesson you mentioned, Caroline is wondering whether citizen science and aiming on impact go hand in hand, and whether that is what you mean with integral. But I think you already explained some more about that in the meantime, but still, does it go hand in hand with citizen science?
I think so. Measuring impact is relevant for any science communication event or activity, and the same goes for, of course, citizen science events. We work together with a couple of citizen science events. One of them is called, it's a Dutch one, Stoepplantjes, which is about all the different types of flowers, plants that grow on pavements in cities. Things that often, plants that often are referred to as weeds and stuff. However, they are really, really good for biodiversity in cities. And this big citizen science project was aimed at informing people on the need and the value of these plants and categorizing all different plants and weeds that were growing on pavements throughout the Netherlands in big urban areas. And even they involved Belgium as well. So it was in 2 different countries that they were doing all these measurements. And it was all citizen science based. Now, what we did with one of those projects, the Stoepplantjes project, was looking at how people got involved in this citizen science project, what their initial motivations were, and if they saw their motivations in the end confirmed, or if they had changed over the time that the project was running. So here we got a lot of information on why people joined a citizen science project like this, as well as what kind of had them continue participating as well, which was very relevant, of course, for this project. And at the same time, they measured how much people knew about the plants that they were categorizing at the same time. So we got information on the knowledge and knowledge gain, as well as participation and attitudes.
Okay, so it can be combined in a very useful manner, but it's not the case that I understood you also mean that in every science communication event, if you want to measure impact, you need to take that into account beforehand, even if it's not citizen science, right?
Yes, indeed, you have to. And measuring impact can be very, very big or very, very small. We had events where we only had the audience engage with one question, but we got a lot of information out of that. So it not necessarily has to be a very big part of the project itself. When you don't have the resources, nor the time, nor the money, nor the people, it still is very valuable to get some information on the effects that you have. Hence, it's important to know what the possibilities are, and then you can start making the necessary decisions.
Okay, that actually, that's part of the answer on another question, namely, most meaningful impact measurement efforts require a lot of time and energy. Now, the person asking this also mentions that as someone who teaches impact measurement to students, he or she is fully sold on the value of it, etc. But the question is, how can you optimize time for measuring impact? Do you have any advice on measuring impact in time-strapped settings?
Mm-hmm. I think it is linked to what I said just now, is make sure that the impact measurement is meaningful, meaning that even if it is one question, two questions, or three questions that you can put out there, make sure that they are worth it. If you don't have the people nor the time to set up a big gamified questionnaire, for instance, you can have autonomous measurements as well. These, for instance, can revolve around some output measurements, observing how many tickets have been sold, seeing how many clicks a different news item has, would of course already be part of an impact measurement. Now, if you were to go beyond that and look at outcomes and really think, okay, have we changed something? Are there any effects? You can do that in many different ways which are not too time consuming. We have listed a couple of them in our toolbox as well. So it's always a good idea, I think, to check that out and see what works for you and what doesn't work for you.
Okay, well, once again, you mentioned something that that occurs in a couple of questions. You mentioned measuring clicks, for example. We have a couple of people who are wondering about measuring impact online. Social media is mentioned, but not only social media. For example, sorry, I need to read the full question. For example, to know whether people actually read the articles or just visit the page. But also, do you have any idea about the impact influencers have?
First, let me answer the first part of that question. There are a lot of analytical tools available to see how people engage with the content that you put out. You can look indeed at the clicks to a certain piece of content. You can look at how much time people spend on that specific page. That gives you a lot of information already. However, again, these are output measures. You look at directly observable interactions between the people and the content that you put out. You don't know anything about if they have learned something, if they are motivated to do something, if their attitudes changed or not. So here we would have to create another type of intervention or type of measurement to know more about that aspect of our impact. Now, what happens a lot, certainly when we deal with online content, is we have little pop-up windows, and we can of course use what is available to us in all these like technical affordances of social media. However, people do not always take well to that. People don't like a pop-up window with extra questions. Hence, it would always be good to integrate this type of measurement into the content that you have created. An example of that is when we worked together with a project that created Twitch streams about ancient Greece. And they did that by playing the game Assassin's Creed Odyssey. And then in the meantime, these were history lectures, in the meantime, just talking about ancient Greece. And teaching people who were watching their streams a little bit about the things that they were doing, seeing, and how it was relevant to like history and the present day. Now, what they did is they integrated a couple of pop-up quizzes within their stream, and then within the chat, they could see how people were reacting to the different questions that they just put out. Because one of their aims was to really teach people something about ancient Greece, the history of ancient Greece, etc. So this was a well-integrated quiz or a well-integrated survey within their Twitch stream. And it made sense because it was part of their stream and it was part of what they were doing eventually. So people were not asked to fill in a quiz or fill in a test afterwards. It was really part of the activity itself or part of the content that was streamed or put out at the same time. So that is a way to actually make sure that these things are part of the activity rather than just an afterthought afterwards.
Do you have any idea? It's an online way of influencing, obviously, but like the more typical science influencers, what elements create impact from successful science influencers? Do you have any tips on that or examples?
What we saw from our research is that there are a couple of triggers that will make people more engaged with certain types of science communication content. When it's about younger people, children up until the age of 18, we mostly say, it is about how much fun they are having and how intense these emotions are. So these are like two different parameters that often spike when people are really engaged with content. And we see that successful science communication influencers, or just influencers in general, have a way of making things relevant to their audience. And that can take many shapes and forms, of course. But the most effective things are things that people can relate to. Having a story in place that makes sense to a lot of different people, making yourself or making the content accessible, approachable, all that is something that really has proven to work in these kind of settings.
And do you have any information from a research project, perhaps? Someone was wondering whether you ever measured that impact. Do you know whether science influencers have a big impact on people, especially youth?
That is a very good question. We have not worked together with a specific science influencer in the time that we were collecting data. However, what we do know is that a lot of our colleagues, but also we ourselves, when we are putting out content, and some of our colleagues are actual science influencers, what they often do is they see a lot of there's a lot of variation in the impact that they have based on the content that they put out. Sometimes it gets a lot of views, and sometimes it gets a lot of it generates a lot of uptake, and sometimes it doesn't. And you would think that it's dependent on the topic they address, or it's dependent on the way they address it. And sometimes that just isn't the case. Sometimes it is something that is picked up by the algorithm, and sometimes it just isn't. So it's not a exact science game sometimes in this whole influencer area. However, there are things you can do, and that is making it personally relevant, making sure that people are engaged within storylines, and making sure that the content that you put out, the case that you want to make, that's really well integrated within all of this, rather than making it a separate standout piece. We see that things that flow are things that people engage with for a longer time than with just standalone ideas, narratives, or projects.
Okay. Yeah, someone else was wondering, how can you continuously measure impact for more long-term project? And an example was a social media page, but do you also have examples of perhaps offline science communication that you can measure on a longer term?
There are a couple of projects that now with us have started measuring their impact and are planning to do that for the next coming years, of course. There is one example of a project. It's called Meet the Professor. It is a project at Utrecht University where professors go into primary school classrooms to just talk about science and talk about their life as a professor, because the idea of a professor to little children is often very stereotypical of an old man with gray frizzy hair in a lab coat. But that might not be the image that we want children to have about scientists and science, because we want a diverse field of scientists, because we know that a lot of people with a lot of different points of view will make science and scientific advancements better. So what this project is aimed at is kind of showcasing the diversity of professors and who and what a professor is. Now, this project has been running for years now and has been measuring its impact in a couple of different ways. And one of those ways is looking at how children, when asked to draw or make a drawing of a professor, what they draw before and after meeting a couple of different professors in real life, and then seeing how have their ideas and attitudes changed. Now, what we want to do in these type of projects is seeing, after years of having these projects in place, if maybe enrollment of students in different science or in different branches, if that can in any way be linked to what has happened before in the projects that were established there. However, there are a lot of variables here to take into account, which we cannot always account for. Hence, this is more of an idea that has been floating around amongst a lot of researchers in the Netherlands that we work with. However, it is difficult, and it's difficult for many reasons. It's because there are a lot of variables, but also for privacy issues, etc. We cannot just monitor a lot of different people individually. What we can do, however, is in big citizen science projects, we can look at how these kind of projects progress over time and who gets involved and why they get involved. And for instance, if that changes over time. So there are, of course, a lot of options. However, it also comes with a lot of obstacles. The ultimate aim, of course, would be to have more insights into long-term effects of things. And there are a couple of examples that we do have, for instance, when it's about vaccination, when it's about health. These are the kind of topics that we do have a lot of information on, and information in the long run. So for these type of projects, we do have some insights, or we are developing some insights. Certainly after COVID or during COVID, we got a lot of new ideas on how to measure long-term impact as well.
Great. So we'll hear about that in the next couple of years, I think. Also.
Yes. And not only from us, from a lot of different players in the field, I'm assuming.
A tiny silver lining, perhaps, in all that chaos we've been through. Another theme that I got a couple of questions about is science communication directed at policymakers. So someone just is asking you about specific advice when you want to direct science communication at policymakers. And someone else is wondering whether it's possible to measure the impact when you do that.
Aiming your science communication activities at policymakers, of course, is a very specific target audience, I would say, which also means that you have to adapt your activities or your events or your information stream towards that specific target audience. What I have to admit that the work that we have done is mostly aimed at the general public and not necessarily at changes in policy making. However, what we have seen is that a lot of policymakers are aware of the different science communication events that are going on, which is a good evolution, of course, when you think about it. However, I think that when you want to have changes in policy, there has to be a certain kind of payoff, and there has to be a certain kind of relevance for policymakers. They have to be able to sell change in policy. They have to be able to account for it. They have to be able to have proper argumentation for it. What we have seen in some cases is that when you create or present solutions to very specific problems, people will listen. Even though what you are planning to do is bigger than the little solutions and little problems that you're addressing, it is a good vehicle to get maybe some more information in, or some bigger changes on the go. But I'm afraid that certainly when it's about policy making, you have to be very strategic, and this can be a lot of trial and error, I'm afraid. Now, measuring the impact of targeting policymakers, I think would, of course, involve looking if policies actually change. And with those changed policies, whether that has an effect on how people engage with those new policies. One could, for instance, be the way we recycle, the way we go about garbage disposal, etc. These are a lot of these are things that people are engaged with and that they find important because it affects their daily lives. And it's also something that policymakers don't necessarily want to touch all the time. Same with some very heavy debates going on about what the pollution of farming industry has to do with destruction of nature reserves, etc. These are like very, very important yet very sensitive topics that we as scientists, of course, have to report on and have to inform policymakers on, making it relevant to them, the policymakers first, and also informing them on what it can mean for the public and how they can maybe sell it to the public, I think would be good policies or good ways of addressing the question how to get policymakers to listen to what scientists have to say.
I was thinking about an example, a very recent one in Flanders, in which you can see that reaching out, having a good story, eventually resulted in a policy change. Namely, Sophie Klaarhout took part in the PhD Cup. Some of you might know it. And now, a couple of years later, she's been doing lots of science communication on different platforms. And now, so her research was about using the Y chromosome without the rest of a DNA profile of an individual to trace back DNA of a crime scene to a relative of possible relative of the person who committed the crime. So I think it's you can go back several, sorry, I'm looking for the right word, but like, for example, a relative in the 46th degree might still be found through the Y chromosome. And very recently, I think 1 or 2 months ago, the Minister of Justice decided to make this legal, this research or this way of tracking down crime scene DNA. So that's just an example of how indeed you can sometimes see a very concrete effect, but I guess it's more difficult to have a general policy impact measurement.
Well, what you can do is work your way around it and change public opinion so that policy has to follow. That's kind of the other way around when you are thinking about changes in policy. Do you want to target the policymaker, or do you want to target the people that will eventually this policymaker has to engage with in order to, for instance, be re-elected? So it depends on what you think would be the best approach, of course. But I think there's like a couple of ways in here when it comes to policy changes.
Okay, thank you. We've got 2 more short questions. But I quickly wanted to mention, since we've been discussing online and social media as tools and how to measure impact on that, our next talk next month is actually with a science influencer, perhaps, and someone who makes videos for companies about science on TikTok, for example. So next month, Jacob Brokken will discuss that theme, and I'll send a link in the chat and in the email that you'll get the following days. So the last 2 questions of today. Your approach seems to imply that you think about measuring impact beforehand, but is it possible to measure impact afterwards?
It is, but it depends on what you want to measure. Some things are easily measured after an event has taken place. Other things are a little bit more difficult to measure in that perspective. Some of the questions that you can put forward are, for instance, questions about, has anything changed in your behavior? These are things that we can measure afterwards, or have to measure afterwards, because these are things that kind of have to crystallize or have to like establish themselves in the real world before people can actually say something about it. There was one project that we worked with that was trying to make people use less plastics in their daily lives. And in their event, they had a lot of different activities. And after it, as people went home again, they asked them to send a postcard to themselves with an intention. Like, oh yeah, my intention is to use less plastic, or my intention is to at least 1 day a week eat vegetarian, or something that had to do with the environment. And they kept on to these intentions on these postcards and then sent them out 1 month later with a QR code where people could indicate if their intentions are actually kept or not, if their resolutions were something that they actually put into practice, yes or no. And this was a very good way of measuring any type of initial behavioral change, which was a very interesting way of doing it. So yeah, it is possible to do it like afterwards. However, thinking about it after you have done your project will limit you in so many ways of getting the information that might be relevant to you. So I would recommend to at least set up or think about the setup of such a measurement rather than having it done afterwards.
Thank you. I love the postcard example. It's really daily, personal, and in your daily lives. That they, yeah. One last question, and I'm really curious to see your reaction. Why are the Netherlands so far ahead of us in this field? And you can compare very well.
Yes, I can. The Dutch government decided 15 years ago that higher education, research, everything that has to do with that it has to have finality. It has to have a certain kind of effect within society. It has to be society. It has to be relevant. That's what they said. Hence, they invested heavily in ways to make sure that the things that were happening in higher education and research, that made it to the public. The Netherlands have different master programs in science communication, something that doesn't really exist in many other places. When you have a bachelor's in biology, mathematics, you name it, you can do, as part of your master's, do 1 year of science communication as well. Hence, the research on science communication is getting well established. And of course, we in the IMPACTLAB strive for that as well. In that sense, the Netherlands is quite ahead when you compare it to other people, to other countries. But it's also based on policy, and it's based on where they want to invest. And of course, these things are always put into question again, because that is what policymakers do, see if the money that they invest, if that actually has an effect. One of the reasons why the IMPACTLAB exists is, I think, because that question was asked. What are the effects of all the science communication activities that are happening within the country? So what we did is looking at who is part of this big target audience, who do we actually reach, and what can we do to improve our reach, as well as the effects that we have throughout the country, nationwide. So I think that is one of the reasons why the Netherlands is actually engaged with not only science communication, but also researching science communication.
All right. Well, thank you so much. Thank you for this whole seminar. People are also thanking you in the chat. I would say, well, for those who were here, some people asked, we will share this video, the video of this webinar afterwards. So thank you, Ward, for that as well. If your colleagues are perhaps interested, you will be able to rewatch and you will get a follow-up email. I'll quickly put the link to next month in the chat because there were some questions about social media and we'll answer some of them in that seminar. And for now, I wish you all a very good afternoon. Thank you so much for being interactive and asking questions. And Ward, thank you for taking the time. And in your case, good night.
Thank you.